First of all, thank you for having me here to NTIDRIT. I'd like to thank everyone who's been involved in bringing me here. The first time I came to the United States to present on deafhood was here at NTID, my very first presentation back in 2004. So, thank you for having me back. Here we are 10 years later, and I thought it'd be a good time to have a retrospective review on where we've come in these 10 years. This is a challenge because with this large audience, I don't know how many of you have familiarity with deafhood's concepts, how many of you it's new to, and how many of you are experienced with the concepts. So I'm going to walk that fine line of trying to make everyone happy in the audience and presenting information that's accessible for all. But let me open by asking you a question and answer honestly. By a show of hands, how many of you are familiar with the concepts of deafhood? One person? Maybe 10%. Okay, so maybe 10% of the audience is familiar with deafhood, which means 90% of you are less familiar with it. Well, thank you, because that's important. Because I'm going to speak to the percentage of the audience who's less familiar with the concept, which may leave us less time to get into some of the detailed information, and I may not be able to share all of my slides. For those of you who are familiar with deafhood, again, I will have to explain a little bit more about some of the concepts, and for those of you who are familiar with it, this may be a little bit more of a review. Whenever I present, I typically choose a person whose honor I'm presenting in for that day, someone who was a pioneer in the field, someone who has passed on their information to the next generation. And so today I present in honor of Robert Panera. You know, it's interesting. You might be thinking to yourself, I wish that I could have met this person before he'd passed. Maybe many names come to mind before they'd passed. And I never met Robert Panera myself, but I've seen clips of his work, and he always had a smile on his face and such positive energy, and I was struck by that because it's so rare to see. And it's unfortunate that I didn't have an opportunity to meet him before his passing, but I present today in his honor nonetheless. I do want to honor two people as well today who are still with us. And I want to thank them for their work and dedication. That's Karen Christie and Paddy. For years, they have worked tirelessly together to collect deaf artwork and to archive it and present about it and expand upon the topic as a whole. So thank you for their work. I present in honor of them as well. The Deafhood Foundation, I'd like to thank them as well for their continued support and dissemination of deafhood principles throughout the United States. So, here are the themes of my presentation today. I will do my best to touch upon all of them. The first one is an introduction to the 10 years of deafhood. Secondly, I'll talk about deafhood as a method of reframing. So we have old traditional models that I think would behoove us if we were to work to reframe some of those concepts. I'll talk about deaf history and colonization. Colonization and that process has an important role in our deaf history. And I sign colonized in a way that we have been taken over and usurped in both our mind and body. And it seems to be a sign that fits our cultural experiences. And then, evaluating the last 10 years will be my final topic. So it's just an opportunity to look back over the 10 years and see where we've come. So, the term and the concept of deafhood, if you're unfamiliar with it, it was first coined by me in 1993. And it didn't go into any greater detail than simply the concept that I was truly enlightened by in a moment of inspiration when the concept came to me. I put the concept to paper. I continued my doctoral studies, and that word came up again and again, and it was helpful throughout my studies and my research. It allowed me a lens with which I could analyze deaf culture and the experiences of deaf people. The book was finally published in 2003. And from that point on, it was translated into a multitude of languages: Japanese, German, Spanish, Portuguese. I don't know if any of you are familiar with that, but Portuguese language was one of the translations, as well as ASL. So I think that's very good progress to date. My original aim in building up the concept of deafhood wasn't to cause strife and conflict. It was not to cause further horizontal oppression within the community. It was a way to promote deaf unity. And we actually have parallel concepts if you look at the movement of feminism. Women's history, women's knowledge. We have these models from other cultural and minority groups. And again, deafhood was a way to reframe our cultural experiences and begin to capture some of them for analysis. Many of you are familiar intuitively with what deafhood is, but at the time it was a way to apply language to our experience. So from 2003, it was wildfire. The concept spread more quickly than I even imagined, to tell you the truth. I didn't expect it to become so widespread and popular. I was asked repeatedly to host workshops, to provide deafhood training, to fly to a variety of locations to teach about the concept of deafhood. And in 2006, from 2006 when I began that to now, I've presented in over 24 countries, over 150 workshops and courses, 24 countries across 5 continents, and to audiences numbering over 10,000, most of whom were deaf, some of whom were hearing allies. Amazing numbers of people interested in this concept. There are courses in deafhood that have been established in 3 places. 3 places in particular, one being Belgium, Ireland, and thirdly here in the United States. We've had groups of individuals come together to have in-depth conversations about deafhood, raising their consciousness, forming unity around the concept of deafhood. The Deafhood Foundation has 4 areas of work where they promote their efforts and energies, one of them being consulting efforts, working with individuals to have a greater understanding of deafhood and the reframing concepts and philosophies that it brings to cultural awareness. Outreach is another one of their efforts. Networking is important. You may use a different sign for networking. So for individuals who are interested in networking and reaching out to other groups and individuals who have a desire to come together to promote the concepts of deafhood. And lastly, grant awards. Recently, the Deafhood Foundation awarded a grant to Laureen Gallimore, and she is working on producing films about the deaf Black cultural experience and their cultural heritage and experiences. So that was one of their most recent grants. Some of the artistic efforts that have come forth from the deafhood movement. Yes, we haven't really had much here locally. There's been much more artistic movements in the West, in Seattle, but some of it is spreading and reaching across the country. LMA Lentz has been very active. She did a one-woman deafhood show that was very popular. There's deafhood and spirituality groups, and you may wonder how spirituality is affected by the concept of deafhood, but it is, and it's been promoted. There have been t-shirts and promotional materials promoting the concept of deafhood. Very popular, amazingly popular. It surprises me still. In Finland and Portugal, these are popular things. There have been deafhood tattoos, believe it or not. I haven't seen one yet. Here in this audience, does anyone have one? I don't know, but there are people who have deafhood tattooed on, be it the side of their foot and the inside of their arm, spelling deafhood on their fingers. Perfect number of letters for tattooing deafhood on your fingers. Each letter representing a letter of the spelled word.
Nancy Rourke is talking about deafhood in art, and it's really interesting because Nancy uses deafhood in her production of art.
So it seems that deafhood has had a great impact on a number of artists, and they are showing that expression through their artistic endeavors. So kudos to you, Nancy, for the wonderful work that you've done. It's hard to say how an individual incorporates the concepts of deafhood. It's different for everyone, but it has seemed to have had an effect on and an impact on the visual deaf artists. I haven't collected a great amount of feedback on the artistic impact of deafhood. I think we should, because I think it's critical information. Maybe questioning individuals to ask themselves how deafhood has affected them and what insight has come from their personal experiences with deafhood. Because I think that it would help us to improve the concept and it would have a greater impact. And then finally, yoga, you see on the list, which is an unusual aspect to be affected by deafhood, but it has been. People have told me that their experiences while meditating, while performing yoga, if they are working on improving their own personal health in a variety of ways, having been a deaf person and suffered from oppression and the damaging effects of that, their efforts in yoga and in revitalizing their spirit, nourishing their soul, it has had an impact on them. Just utilizing the positive concepts of deafhood. if you wonder why there's had such an impact, I apologize in saying I don't have an answer. I'm amazed by it myself. It's almost as if another person had coined the term, I would be so interested in it. But because I coined the term, I guess humility keeps me from really understanding how it's had such a powerful impact to tattoo your body with the term deafhood. There's been deaf pride and deaf power, but no one has tattooed those words on their body from what I understand. So somehow deafhood touches us on a deeper level. And I don't know exactly how that is. Maybe you can share with me via feedback or email or further communication to help me understand how and why it's been so powerful for so many people. All we know about deafness is really brought together under the umbrella of the deafhood concept. And so maybe that's why it's so powerful. Other people say the concept of deafhood simply helps them reframe their personal experiences in a political lens, and it helps communities become more politically connected. Other people have said to me that focusing on positive deaf achievements and the positive aspect of deaf history is an empowering experience for them. So those are just a few of the bits of feedback that I've heard. It's important that I let you know in a very cautionary way that I don't have all the answers, even though I may have coined the term. I don't necessarily have the answer with regard to what's next. It's interesting to me that I've become so personally drawn into the historical timeline of the deaf experience. It's easy to talk about the individuals who were so impactful in past years, but being in the moment, forging the path, and not having a clear picture of the future is a new experience for me. And so because it's new, I don't have all of the answers. It's a learning process for myself. All of you contribute in your own unique ways, and if we can come together to build a shared understanding and community growth and unity from that, I suppose that's how it will go. I think the number one thing I say to people is chill out, take it easy on one another, be kind, be gentle, right? We really don't have all the answers. We're all working through this together. To come to odds, to have heated tempers, and it's unnecessary. The infighting is not helpful. It's a new process for all of us, and we need to work through it together. So, let me think about how I want to utilize the information I have here to talk about reframing in greater depth. If we consider decolonization of our community, and I'll explain these terms as I go on. It would seem that we may question the very existence of deaf people. Are we a biological mistake? Were deaf people never meant to be, or is there a higher purpose for deafness and deaf people being here on earth? Are we blessed by a higher power? And it's not so much a spiritual question as it is a philosophical one, that there is something larger than us, larger than those of us here on earth. So if we consider that spiritual philosophical connection, it gives us a positive lens with which to view our experiences. It allows us to look at oppression from a different way, because oppression impacts each one of us on a personal level, but we need to unpack those personal experiences with some insight. And deafhood and its concepts allow us to not feel alone in doing so, but to come together and recognize that we're part of a larger community and family of individuals. So, some big questions come up when you consider that philosophical approach. What is deafness, and what does deaf mean? We all have a medical understanding of hearing loss per se, but I wouldn't necessarily say we have a deeper cultural understanding of what deafness means. Again, it leads us to more philosophical questions. Do we have a philosophy of life as deaf people? Are there deafhood philosophies? We know we share common experiences, and so because of that, maybe we do have a common philosophy. But if we do, it hasn't been categorized or researched at this point. We experience oppression from that. Maybe some deaf people have begun to put together their own particular philosophies on deafhood. And yet another important question, an even larger question, is questioning deaf culture. Ironically, my book focuses on deaf culture. That's the topic of the book. Deafhood is an important aspect of analyzing that culture. And yet, my book was about culture, but culture has been overlooked because the concept and the empowering aspect of deafhood has become so popular. So we still need, even 10 years later, we need to go back and relook at culture. And what does deaf culture mean? What does it entail? I would venture that most of us don't have a ready answer. Deaf humor we're familiar with. We understand what's funny and what's not. Someone who's not of a deaf experience culturally may not find certain things funny. So there's something deeper that we tap into naturally, but we haven't labeled yet. We haven't gotten into the analysis of it on a deeper level. Do we want deaf education run in a deaf way? And if that's what we say we want, then what exactly does that mean? Do we have a clear vision and a model of what our deaf services would be, ideally? Because to date, we've simply replicated a model of the hearing culture. So what would a deaf cultural approach be to television, for example? You don't have deaf TV here in the States, and that's unfortunate for you. There are other countries that have fought that battle and have won some connections to having deaf television and interpreted performances. But again, if we are going to begin to fight that battle, as we do so and make the requests and demands that would come of it, what is it we are saying that we want? That needs to be clarified. A rather complex model. Don't worry, don't stress out. I want to make sure everyone can see it, but this is the first time I'm using this in a presentation. It was published as part of the book, but it's been tweaked and polished and refined. So let me begin by asking you this question. Imagine a series of concentric circles as part of a model, and at the very inner core is the medical model, the medical dimension of how deafness is viewed. It reduces us to the smallest aspect of who we are as people. Beyond that, we reach out to a social welfare dimension where we are, as deaf people, recipients of social welfare services. Beyond that, we reach the human rights dimension of deafness and the deaf experience. Disability laws, discrimination legislation, access services. That's where we encounter the human rights dimension. And at that third dimension, we focus on the individual as opposed to the group. It's an individual's rights to access. It's always about the single person as opposed to the larger cultural group. A level beyond that begins to bring groups together, but it's with regard to linguistic minorities. And so we're analyzing the language of the minority group, the bicultural, bilingual approach for education. The problem with even this fourth layer out in this dimension is that we are not yet addressing the collective culture of deaf people. We're still seen from the outside. We're seen as users of sign language, but not as a culturally whole deaf person. And so as we move out from those limiting dimensions. The outermost ring, which would allow us the greatest access and understanding, would be the deafhood dimension, which would finally include the collective culture, history, arts, spiritual issues that each deaf person, as a member of a larger cultural group, experiences. It would include autism and post-colonization as well. It would finally allow the outside world to see us, not just for our deafness, not just for our need for services, but finally as culturally whole individuals, members of a larger group. If we don't have an understanding of our deaf history, there's no way that we can have an understanding of ourselves as deaf individuals, because we are all products of our historical experiences. Have an understanding of oppression in the past and historical events, and that will allow us to better understand oppression. We'll have an understanding not simply what it means as a single vocabulary word, but how it's impacted us on a personal level in a variety of ways. So again, when I talk about colonialism and being colonized by the larger society, there are academic, linguistic approaches to other cultures' experiences of colonization. One culture coming in to usurp and colonize another. And there have been, over 250 years or so, some cultures that have been colonized, the Native Americans, other cultures, and they've all been studied to quite some level of depth. But what we need to begin to do is recognize the parallels of those other minority cultures and begin to document it to help us as a deaf community understand our own cultural experiences of colonization and begin to see a way to decolonize our cultural experience. Typically, colonization will happen from one people to another because of financial gain. Maybe a particular country or people have oil or another resource that's in demand. It's not typically done for linguistic purposes, but when colonization happens, typically the minority culture's language is degraded until it's decimated and no longer exists. If a community loses their native language and has to adopt the language of the imperialist community, it causes to each member of that minority community a sense of damage to their self. There have been many languages that have been lost to colonization. For example, when the British colonized India, millions of people in India, millions of people in Britain, in a very small island, were able to colonize the people of India and divide them and cause infighting amongst the people of India. And that infighting only weakens the groups as small individual groups, which simply allowed the colonization to happen at a deeper, faster level. So that's one of the purposes of colonization, is to divide the people which they're attempting to conquer. There are always some members of a colonized community who manage to persevere, continue to have freedom of thought, decolonize themselves to some level, but there's always some resulting damage to a people or a culture that's been colonized. You lose the historical aspect. You lose some of the history because of the shame, because of the loss of the older generations. And so when you get generations beyond that, we need to look back to see who were we when we were colonized, and who were we prior to colonization? It's only when you can go back to your original model of the cultural experience prior to colonization that you can begin to build a program for reconstruction of your culture and decolonization of your community. In order to do that, you need to document the information, look back historically, and build a vision from there. Because without a vision, you're not able to make great inroad changes in decolonization. With a vision, it allows you a structure and a vision and something to work toward over time, working together programmatically and systematically to make changes. Education has been an unfortunate result of colonization and the colonization of deaf children and the changes that have taken place in education. When England colonized New Wales, children were not permitted to speak their Welsh language. So what would happen in the morning when children arrived to school? They would listen to a word in their native Welsh, and whoever got caught speaking Welsh would be physically punished. Yet the children were desperate to try to continue to remember the words of their native language.
All day, children were taught to tell on each other. He spoke Welsh, so then they could take the shame necklace or label off, and it was put on the next child to speak Welsh. So they were taught to tell on each other, and therefore their home language, their native language, was wiped out.
Deaf people have been colonized, their education system has been colonized for over 100 years, and the children are suffering. Originally, deaf instructors and teachers were fired. They were displaced and never replaced by other deaf people. There's been a strong focus on oral education, and because of that, we lost many of our very important and historically critical deaf minds. They were the keepers of the historical knowledge. They were the pioneers for hundreds of years. And upon the colonization of our deaf education system, they were simply cut off, and we've lost that historical perspective. Deaf history has lost an important aspect. If you look back to very old publications of deaf magazines, you will see regularly photographs of schools for the deaf talking about their events, and there was such a sense of pride amongst the community. But the colonization and the oralization of deaf communities and schools laid that all to waste. Oralism is back. It's raging again with the use of cochlear implants, oral training of deaf children with cochlear implants. Here we have over 1,000 deaf students using sign language, and that's a wonderful thing. But in England, the oral method is still the most popular method. Implants are more popular than ever. And so here you're doing a wonderful job, and you're studying it, and so I applaud you for that. We need to celebrate that we're not dead yet. We're still fighting this war, and some of us are making inroads. And we always need to remember to be mindful and grateful for those of us who have come before in continuing the fight. We need to thank and be grateful for the allies who work with us side by side. So, here's an important concept. Imagine you grow up hearing, and in doing so, you integrate one culture, your native culture. So, if you grow up with one culture, you integrate naturally that one culture. But if you are of a minority culture, Black, Deaf, Native American, you essentially have to integrate two cultures. You integrate the American majority culture as well as your minority culture. And if those two cultures are of equal status, then you can integrate them without any damaging effects. But if they're not of equal status, then there's always the internal struggle of which culture wins out and which culture do you follow. So I'll talk about it a little bit more in depth, but this is just the first explanation of the concept. So if you're an individual who's integrating two disparate cultures, you're going to have some internal conflict over it. And individuals who are fighting these internal conflicts have some effects. You may look to the majority culture and ignore your minority culture of deafness. Or you may solely focus on your deaf culture and ignore the majority culture. And so people are being forced to choose one culture over another. And there's no one right answer, but people tend to choose one culture over another. And it's a very difficult situation for an individual to be in. So if we consider the concept of decolonization, you have to understand initially the process of colonization. You have to understand the effect on the individual and how that process happened. There are psychological impacts on an individual. There are confidence and fear. The result is lack of confidence and fear issues, worrying about what the others think of me, self-doubt. And there are effects on education, employment opportunities, a number of issues where an individual suffers the impacts and the damage. But we don't know specifically about deaf cultural damage because we haven't taken the time to look at it. We may assume that the damage isn't permanent, but I think that we just haven't gotten to really looking deeply at the concept.
When you think about cultural damage, you think about how people perceive you. And if we go back to the medical model I showed you, sometimes people perceive us as only by our hearing status. And sometimes we then turn around and oppress others or reflect those negative images out into the world. If you think about racism, or if you think about feminism, or all the other types of oppression that have been experienced by different minorities, there are some definite commonalities between these groups who have been oppressed.
Just say it.
With minorities, people are being oppressed.
Okay, sorry. Go ahead. That's great.
In the United States, we have white deaf people and black deaf people who have been oppressed for many years. And if you go into Gallaudet, you can see the residual effects of this. If you look at NAD, the National Association for the Deaf, they talk about oppression of minorities in different ways. But that's something that we have learned and that we have internalized, is how we have been perceived in a negative way by all these outside groups. If you think about Northern Ireland and the conflicts with religion in Northern Ireland between the Catholics and the Protestants, the deaf people in Northern Ireland chose not to be involved in that conflict, but instead worked together as a unified front. I don't know if the young people know about the country of Yugoslavia. Are you familiar with Croatia and Yugoslavia? There's a war that has been raging for years in the Balkans. During that time, the deaf people again chose not to align themselves with the hearing culture and the problems that they were having, but instead work together as a group. So I think it's important to know what happened before the spread of oralism in the 1880s and the 1900s. What did we have prior to that we can draw from? If you read the literature and the history, you will know that before oralism spread, we had deaf
actors, educators, writers, salesmen, lawyers, artists. And then when oralism became popular, those occupations by deaf people were no longer open to them. Deaf painters were gone, deaf educators were gone. The Paris salons, I think, is very famous. I'm not sure if you've heard of that before, but there were select artists who would have master competitions with over 100 deaf entries where their works would be displayed. After Milan and the oralism popularity, those artists were disappeared and were diminished. So there's some connection between visual art and Devia, is what we've been talking about today, and how sign language is then regaining its power. But anyway, I have a little game for you. Suppose when we're finished with the lecture, you're out one evening and you're in a bar chatting with your friends. If you were to say to your friends, what would it be like if oralism had never happened? What do you think the world would look like? I dropped that for you to think about. It's a little game that I like to play. Think about the things. It forces you to think about the outcomes and how things may be. I'm not giving you any of the answers, mind you, but I'm going to let you discuss that on your own. So, in France, from 1779 to the 1850s, it was an amazing time for deaf people. Deaf people had a successful life. Unfortunately, I don't have time to tell you all the tales I would like to about the thriving deaf community at that time period. But I can tell you about different writings. One was Deloge in 1779, was the first deaf person to write and publish a book. And some of the writings back then are more powerful than even things we can come up with today. And what's that, 225 years ago? The writings were amazingly philosophical and interesting. If you look at Lang and Lane and Philip in 1994, you can see some parallels between the two concepts in the publications. Mesu and Claire, their writings were published in 1815. Here's copies of the writings. This is a book. It's a 200-page book, and here's an excerpt from it. This was published, as I said, in 1815. I'm sorry. This was published in London. It was written in a 2-column system, one column being French and the other column being English. I'm not sure if you're familiar, but back then, deaf people would get up in front of hearing audiences and deaf audiences, and they would have dialogues and have question periods. So what they would do is write French on one part, the answers, and then English on the other side. So it was proving their competence and their wisdom, and that happened back in the 1850s. I know, 1815. I know it's hard to think about philosophers and deaf education back then, but it was quite a thriving popularity. It was quite a thriving community. Berthier and his colleagues formed, I don't know if you know what it's called, the Paris banquets. I will talk about that. Deaf educators, people who had beautiful writing and beautiful skills. Again, this is before Oralism would stand up and talk about their philosophies and their experiences. As we move ahead to the Paris banquets of 1830s, this started at the school. The Paris school wanted the hearing audiences outside the school to take note of what they do and their importance within the community. So they would host banquets where philosophers and deaf artists and deaf publishers and deaf writers would come to talk about the School for the Deaf and their activities. And the outside community was invited to come attend these banquets. At that point, there were no trains, no planes, no automobiles, right? So people would gather in their horses and carriages, and at the moment, the deaf people saw that they had a world of communication, meaning that international visitors could come and they would understand each other. They were very proud of their ability to communicate with each other and thanked God for their talents. The banquets after the banquets were finished and all the people would get up and give their lectures and their presentations, they were then printed and put in documented volumes. And they still have these volumes intact today if you would like to go back and reread them. This is an example of one of the Paris banquets. You might notice one problem in this picture. Does anybody see the problem with the picture? First of all, the setting of the table, that's one thing, yes, but what else? There are no women in the picture, exactly. There is not one woman there, so I guess that that concept hasn't come to light yet, that women should have been included. But women were invited later, but not in this particular time. Also, with hearing people, it was the same issue that they faced as the women did. So, back in the day in France, there were so many positive points to be considered. Today, oralism has taken over not only us, but the division of who we are as a deaf community. Before oralism, the idea of who you could be as a deaf person, whatever your divine rights were, whatever your human rights are to language and culture was given to you. But after the spread of oralism, those rights were taken away from us. So the concept of deaf culture as it was back in France then shrank. We became very protective of those from the outside trying to impose their views on us. I think it's important that we think about deaf culture and try and bring back those old feelings and those old practices. I think it's in time to feed deaf culture and let it grow and spread. So the concept of deafhood, what has happened in the past needs to be brought back into our lives and to help us grow in our feelings. Again, like I keep looking at Nancy talking about deaf art, because I think that's important. There was a Scottish deaf sailor. There was a Scottish deaf sailor who last year was sailing around the world alone. He didn't have any radio connection because he was deaf. In 2009, another person went around the world. So there were 208 people before him. I'm sorry. Excuse me, that was an interpreter. There was 208 people before him, and now this one deaf person had finally done it. So that was one more example of the things we can do that we had in the past been told we cannot. Deafhood is a journey that we all experience. We all come from different backgrounds. Some people come from a mainstream environment. Some people come from a school for the deaf. So we all have our individual paths in life, and for that I respect everyone. Everyone's journey is just that, their own journey. One thing I think that is critical for us to understand and is often misunderstood in the United States is that deafhood can be compared to back in the day when we talked about capital D and small d deaf people. That is not what deafhood is. That is the opposite of deafhood. This is one-upmanship. This is oppressing other people because we're not the same. If you think of I'm a better or more deaf person than you because of our language or our history or our backgrounds, that is inappropriate. That is not what deafhead is beyond. This is beyond any of those minor arguments. We need to let those distinctions between ourselves go.
Nobody escapes the negative effects.
Nobody escapes the negative effects of being oppressed and having the impacts from the hearing culture put upon us. The key to deafhood is equality. We've experienced the problems and we've experienced the negative impacts of the hearing culture on us, and if we turn to our neighbors and our other deaf friends and do the same thing to them, we are just modeling the oppression that the hearing people have put upon us. That is not the purpose, and it helps no one. It doesn't help us to bicker and argue between each other to say, I am a more important or I am a more deaf person than you are. There's a famous book called Animal Farm, written in English. The Animal Farm? This is a good comparison to that. We don't want to replace and have a, quote, deaf animal farm. I had visited a school for the deaf, and my experience there was quite interesting. I talked to them about a deaf studies program, and they said, oh, people from deaf families don't want that. I already know everything about deafness because I'm from a deaf family. I know. And so I looked at the group of people I was talking to, and I said, so if people are born in America, do they say, well, I was born in America, and I'm from an American family, so I know everything about American history, so I don't need to learn anymore. That's not the way that goes. We need to learn about geography, culture, backgrounds. So for people to say, I'm from a deaf family, so I don't need to learn about the history of deafness, I think is ironic and inappropriate statement. Now let's take a look back. I think part of deafhood that we need to explore is definitely about education. We need to have a dialogue and feedback, and we need to have empowerment about our own education system. And I'm talking about me specifically. This is a big need for me. Of course, there's time to challenge oppression, and that often has a political context to it. But to be honest with you, everything in this world has a political tie to it in some way or another. If people say this isn't politics, they're wrong. It is, because any system you face is a political system. So you can't say, I'm not political, I'm neutral. That's impossible because you're embedded in an inherently political system. There is no such thing as neutral. Deafhood, is it political? Yes, to some extent. But at the same time, it's not completely consumed in the political machine. If we were to do that, we would then turn around and divide our deaf community again, which is something I do not want to do. So I think it's important to keep a balance. And it's difficult to maintain a balance when you're trying to support, challenge oppression, and work through a large system. But if you focus your energies too much on that, then you become so political that you're missing the cultural and other portions of it. And again, I don't think we have all the answers at the moment, but these are all questions we need to work on together. From my own experience, I think it's important to have a group that focuses on lobbyism and marching and protesting and working against the hearing systems of oralism and oppression. But then we need other systems and other groups to focus on different fronts. It's important to address each of the issues that we're having in different ways and to balance our energies. We've had some very interesting developments in Deafhood. Deafhood Foundation. I don't know, have you been involved in the courses? I think some of you may have participated in some of the Deafhood courses being offered by the foundation. I know quite often people have to go to different states to be able to participate in these courses. We have Deafhood 101, and now we're developing 201 and 301. It is a bit complicated. I have to admit it's not an easy process. We're working our way through it as we go. Sometimes it's difficult when you don't hold the concepts clearly yourself to turn around and teach it to another person, but we're on the road together learning and teaching this. The courses talk about specific groups, for example, parent groups. We talk about hearing parents and deaf parents. We work with them. 101, the introductory course, is modified to work with hearing and deaf parents, also with our hearing allies who want to participate. We work with our hearing allies to educate them and give them the basic foundations of deafhood. We also work with interpreters, which I'm happy to see that expanding even more today. We also work with children of deaf adults. We have many of those folks in the groups as well. So we're having very positive reception to that course, and I think so far we've done quite a nice job. Ireland is on a waiting list at this point. The Irish people have asked over and over if they can participate in these courses, and they're happy to pay for them, just as we do here in the United States. But you have to understand it's not developed in England and they want everything free there because of the type of socialism system that they're used to, and they're not used to having to pay for something. So that's their bit of colonialism that they're not used to yet, thinking in a different way. If we'd like to talk about Belgium, they have been going, they've been taking these courses now for the last 3 years. If you think about our lives and how we have developed, and you think about the colonialism that was put onto us, we have to stop for a moment and think about who we are and take a look at us, look at ourselves individually. We have to think about our history. We have to think about deaf studies. We have to think of all this in a positive way. We have to know who we are and where we come from first. And then once you have that within you and you can see that that's where you're from, then the colonialization will then go away. I think people assume that I assume that everyone is as interested in history as I am, but obviously that's not the case. So where are the courses for deaf history? There aren't any. Well, I shouldn't say that. I mean, every once in a while there's one here and there, but I think what we need to do is repair the wounds and the damage that has been caused by oralism, see where we are today, and then reframe all of these courses and start again.
So it's going to require that we develop more coursework in specialty areas. It's important that we include deaf professionals, because even the deaf professionals have been affected by colonialism, and bring forth the traditional values of the colonialist hearing society. We need to have individuals who are qualified. The problem is their qualifications are from a criteria set forth from a colonialist perspective. We need to have, unfortunately, many deaf individuals are afraid. They're fearful of stepping out and doing something differently. Yet deafhood training for those individuals would begin to build their self-confidence. It would lessen their fear of stepping forward and speaking out. So that needs to happen first. We need to build confidence. Deaf lawyers should have their own course in deafhood. They're servicing. They're very conservative in their manners and ways, and we need to have specific training for them. Deaf superintendents. Not an easy job that they face. It's a very difficult job. It's really an unfortunate time in history to be a deaf superintendent, with the pressures that they face from the educational system and the outside world, and their necessary job to promote deaf education. So we should have some specific course that trains them in deafhood to bolster them in their abilities to advocate for children's rights. In England, we have deaf professionals who are individuals as deaf professionals, yet simultaneously come together as groups to share their knowledge, preserve their knowledge, and pass forth information from generations past, because they know that if they come together collectively, then they individually benefit. So, if one superintendent has a problem in their school, instead of sharing it with other superintendents, sharing their knowledge, coming together in a supportive way, they don't do that. They hide their mistakes. They try to cover up the issues, and that doesn't help the community as a whole, and it certainly doesn't help the children in their educational experiences. So we need to find a way to break through the fear and the barriers and the shame that deaf individuals face on professional levels, and allow them to come together and work collectively. Deaf blind, deaf minorities, interpreters, parents, other minority groups within the deaf world all need to come together to participate in courses, but we need to understand that we need to maintain a level of respect for their individual minority culture that they dually carry within them, right? Because some individuals have a multitude of cultures that they carry within them. The hearing majority culture, their deaf culture, their deaf minority culture, be it African American or Native American. And so they are juggling a number of cultures and having great amounts of internal conflict as a result. Native American, gay, lesbian, women, these are all individuals who carry within them a multitude of identities that they're trying to find a delicate balance and maintain. Now, my book focused on researching deaf history and deaf culture and our cultural experiences historically, trying to define what culture meant. But in order to defining what culture means today, we need to look back and see what culture meant then, what traditions were important, what mores were important, and bring those forward. There's no way that we can begin by simply being in the present of 2014. We need to look back. We need to carry those traditions forward and begin to rebuild from there. Problem is that in the United States, no one has done that research on the historical aspects of deaf culture. No one's interviewed the elderly deaf individuals, the individuals who were pioneers and community leaders and the original builders of the communities. We've had so many aspects of deaf culture go by the wayside, deaf clubs, deaf schools, that we're losing so much of that past before we can actually document it. We need to study it so that we can individually internalize it and then be those who carry the torch forward to the next generation. There's not necessarily money and funding for individuals who want to study cultural historical experiences. Someone may receive individual funding to study something that is less historically relevant, but funding is an issue, and it's one issue that we need to broach in order to succeed in our further studies. The impact that deaf culture historically has had, there are positive and negative impacts from deaf culture. We need to shift our focus and begin to look again in greater depth at the deaf positive experiences. It's almost the same disparity you have between the haves and the have-nots. We need to have a complete vision of our cultural past so that we can understand where we came from, so that we can understand the aspects of deaf culture that we share and the aspects of deaf culture that we no longer share with regard to what we did in the past. We are stuck in a place right now where deafness and disability movements are at odds, and we need to find a way to integrate them together for our benefit. In other countries, in England as well, we have had political protest marches demanding the recognition of sign language rights, which is wonderful. They've done good work. It's a very positive outcome. However, our initial good efforts have had less than stellar outcomes in the most recent future. There have been opposing groups that have not carried forth our original efforts of protecting the language rights of deaf children. They have tainted our original argument and, as a result, have tried to purport the need for more interpreters and more service-oriented language access. They're not developing the community from the aspect of deaf children. They're promoting the social welfare limited dimension view of what the deaf community needs. And it's frustrating because our initial efforts have been diminished. We have legislation and we have culture. Culture is to protect and preserve and to promote. And some of the cultural legislation that we see represented by UNESCO is very beneficial to us. So we can work together with the disability rights movement. it's not only about language recognition, but it's about the recognition of the person as a culturally whole being and member of a larger community. But it's still a struggle to bring the two aspects together of disability and deafness. We may need to embrace the label of disability in order to gain further inroads in access, but simultaneously we need to bolster our cultural and community understanding, our deafhood experiences. They are two simultaneous yet distinct efforts that we need to put forth.
It's like Jesus said to Caesar, sometimes we need access to your world, but we also have to do that through legislation. But he also had a community group that was focusing on their own needs at the same time. And I compare that to deaf culture. We need more deaf schools. We need more deaf university studies. We need funding for those things on a permanent basis. For example, my department was shut down. I don't know if you realize this. After 35 years, it was gone. Just like that, and disappeared into the night. So I think we need to have the cultural view to protect things, but we need legislation to gain access to laws.
We have preservation of many other cultural aspects like museums. Deaf television needs to receive greater funding. Deaf PBS, so to speak. Those all need to be funded. That's where cultural legislation can begin to bolster the positive aspects of deafhood. What we've succeeded in getting in England, you need to use those as models to begin to have legislation that protects the cultural aspects of the community. So now I'd like to challenge you, right, with the understanding that you carry dual identities within you as a member of a majority and a minority culture. You need to consider what that majority cultural representation is that you carry within you. It's a hearing individual, most likely, a hearing American. And we also contain within us a deaf American. But we need to have an understanding that we do have that duality within us. We need to accept it. I'm not talking about individuals who don't want to behave in culturally deaf ways. I'm simply talking about the aspect of growing up in the larger majority culture and having those cultural values integrated within you as an individual.
If an African American person flew to Africa and they would arrive and say, "Hi, I'm just like you are," the native African people would say, "No, you're not," because they've internalized some American culture. They'd be looking for a hamburger, so to speak, when there wasn't one available. That's true with us. We have to think about our hearingness, or the hearing part of the culture that has influenced our life as well. You have some unconscious things in you that if you don't keep an eye on it, it will run your life. If you think about it, know it, embrace it, and control it, then it can be used to control and benefit both of your identities, and you can grow from having both of those identities in you.
So we're getting there. We're getting there. I know time is running short. So who has done some international travels? Anyone? By a show of hands? Very few. Okay. So for those of you who have traveled internationally, you know what the deaf experience is. It's inspiring, it's life-changing. It allows us to bolster our deafhood experiences and begin to experience those cultural holism opportunities. There are Deaf Olympics, there's the World Federation of the Deaf. There are opportunities where internationally large numbers of deaf people come together and have opportunities to communicate and grow as individuals and have rich cultural experiences. Deafway 2, for those of you who may have gone to Deafway 2, anyone in the audience have an opportunity for Deafway 2? There were 9,000 flags representative of the nationalities and countries. It was a very clear way to shoot down oralism and see a coming together of culturally deaf international communities. It was amazing. This is an important experience that we need to begin to bring into our own lives, because the deaf world is not a small world. I had one slide point that talked about the French deaf experience. but I don't think I have time to get into it. But let me see if I can distill this down to my final point. You may meet a deaf person from India if you travel to that country. And in doing so, they will welcome you into their world. They will serve as a cultural and local guide to you. They'll introduce you to their culture, It's different than when you see a group of tourists arrive to a country on a bus, and they all exit the bus and take pictures of the landmines and then landmarks, and then they get back on the bus and drive away without ever
experiencing the culture in which they're visiting. So it's a very peripheral experience of the other language, but somehow deaf people have it within them to communicate with one another. And they value communication so much that they are willing to let go of their national identity and just become a global citizen. In that way, they communicate successfully with one another. Everyone says the deaf world is very small, but it's exact opposite. The deaf world is enormous and boundless. Someone in the front is from Nebraska. He was telling me that most of his family and friends stay in Nebraska, and they have kids and they stay there throughout their lives. Born and raised in Nebraska and never leave. Deaf people need to get out in the world, travel internationally, meet other citizens of the world. And many hearing people are stuck in their small community. They're very local. Their experience is local. The deaf world is very big. For me, the gift that we offer deaf children is that knowledge. You can tell the hearing parents of deaf children, your children will become global citizens. They will travel all over the world, and they'll be able to communicate with other deaf people. And that's a gift that we can give to those hearing parents of deaf children and to the deaf children themselves. National Association of the Deaf. We have BDA in Britain. There's not enough focus on culture and battling for our cultural rights. Maybe we should provide deafhood training to those organizations. Another suggestion, in England, they had set up a lobbyist group separate from the NAD or the PDA. The lobbyist group will go to Washington and fight for deaf rights and legislation that supports access and the like. A group of us can do that, and then a group can be the clean hand group, if you will, who are just the faces, the public positive faces, while some of the rest of us do the dirty work, the lobbying in Washington to get legislation passed. It has been successful in Britain, but it has to be a coordinated effort. If there's no communication between two groups, it will ultimately fail. Okay, very briefly. My next book focuses on education. It's critical that deaf people receive education, and deaf people must educate themselves to be successful. We've done amazing things in our time. In 250 years of deaf education, there haven't been enough books written about that, about deaf skills, deaf pedagogies. Nothing has been written. Maybe a few dissertations, a few articles have been published. Honestly, it has just scratched the surface of the volumes of information that are within deaf educators. 250 years and nothing has been produced? That's a failure. People throw up their hands and say, oh, well, I really couldn't do anything about it. No one's ever asked us. We need to ask that question. We need to get that information disseminated. The future of deafhood can be what it wants to be. It's very exciting. You want to link your mind, your body, and your spirit to a healthy self-image. We can work to improve social welfare. We can work with deaf minorities and codas. Genetics is a big hot topic now, of course, as you probably all know. You see a lot of young deaf professionals getting very successful. In England, the deaf film industry as having a huge, wonderful expansion. The problem with it is that the young generation is disconnected from the older generation. They refuse to work with one another. The young people think the old people are boring, and the old people think the young people are brash and ignoring the history. So it's essential that we bridge that generation gap and they respect one another. The situation is the same in American culture with minorities. The Native American youth are ignoring their Native American roots. Within the Black community, the same thing is happening as well. So in the future, we need to set up more deafhood and forums to analyze what is that American culture inside of you and what is the deaf culture inside of you. What are the positives and negatives of both of those identities? Keep the positive within you. Examine the negative and get rid of it. Reframe it, change it. And it is a process that requires a lot of work. We need to disseminate that progress or that process to all of our people. African Americans have experienced the same process. Women have experienced the same process. They have experienced oppression in the past, and instead of allowing that to define their future, they're reframing it and moving on from it. You might think that the connection to hearing people is not important, but it is critically important. Slavery occurred here in America. Who stopped slavery in America? It was black and white people working together, fighting against the institution of slavery. Apartheid in South Africa. Who achieved the end of apartheid in South Africa? It wasn't one person alone. It was groups of people of various colors working together, and they became successful. So it's not just one person that needs to spread deafhood. It's all of us working together, hearing and deaf. Some great hearing people say, I don't want to do anything within the arena of deafhood because I don't want to become an oppressor. But what I say to them is, you really have to get involved. You have to get involved because you have to be an ally. We need a positive influence. Everyone has a part to play. We don't want a lousy hearing person to show up, of course. But we need to get on with it together. We don't want the hearing people to take over our vision because we haven't yet solidified that vision. So it would be easy for us to be recolonized again. As soon as we come up with something that we want, then we can go ahead and invite those allies to join us in the fight. It is critical to respect and learn about other minority cultures. Native Americans and Black history have a rich culture. It's inspiring and very powerful, the struggle and the spirit with which they fought and did not give up. We can learn a lot from these other minority cultures in America. We have to keep an open mind while doing that. We can't say, those African Americans, their culture is hearing. That's not for us. They've had the same oppression and battles that we have had throughout history. So instead of discounting their experience, we need to learn from that. Claire was never dismissive of hearing people. He learned about culture and language and fought for that. Disability studies is also vital. We have to understand people's attitudes toward us and how we can fight against that. They have certain views because of what they have learned. And if we can understand why they've learned that, we can change their minds and reframe their activities. We need to get to work on deafhood very quickly because genetic engineering is very near. It's coming for us. It's going to be here soon. This is a very urgent need. Eugenics is a real thing, and it is really happening. We fought for years against implanting children with cochlear implants. Eugenics has become much worse because it's part of the society now, and people are just accepting the idea of if you have a deaf baby, you automatically implant that baby. We need
genetic engineering would be much more damaging because it prevents the birth of deaf children. And it is bearing down on us. It's oppression and what is in the future that really should motivate us on a very deep level to become active in embracing our deafhood and coming together as a community. I'd like to thank you for your patience, and I appreciate you being here attending today's lecture.